The clash of steel on steel, the thunder of cavalry charges, the cries of warriors locked in battle. These are the images that dominate our imagination of medieval warfare. But behind every sword raised in triumph, every suit of armor deflecting a fatal blow, there was a master of fire and metal whose name history often forgets. Picture this: deep in the smoky glow of a forge, hands blackened with soot, a blacksmith hammers a glowing blade into shape. This isn't just craftsmanship, it's the quiet shaping of destiny. While kings and knights claimed glory on the battlefield, it was the blacksmiths who armed them, who turned raw iron into instruments of power, and who, without a single swing of a sword, decided the fate of nations. Think about the sheer weight of their responsibility. A single flaw in a sword could mean the difference between life and death for a knight. A poorly fitted helmet could spell disaster for an entire army. Blacksmiths weren't just artisans. They were the backbone of medieval warfare, the unseen strategists whose work dictated the outcomes of wars. Their forges were factories of survival, where the secrets of tempering steel and crafting unbreakable armor were guarded like state secrets. And yet, their stories are rarely told. How did these men and women working in the shadows become the unsung architects of empires? This is the story we're unraveling today, the hidden legacy of blacksmiths and their fiery artistry. From the humble village smithy to the royal armories of Europe, their innovations quietly revolutionized warfare. They didn't just make weapons, they perfected them, pushing the limits of metallurgy to create blades that could slice through inferior steel and armor that could withstand the fiercest blows. Their influence stretched far beyond the battlefield, shaping economies, trade routes, and even the rise and fall of dynasties. So let's step into the heat of the forge, where history was hammered into existence, and discover how these masters of metal quietly shaped the medieval world, and why their legacy still burns bright today. The story of medieval blacksmiths begins not with the clang of battle, but with the steady rhythm of the hammer shaping plowshares and hinges. In the early Middle Ages, these skilled metalworkers were village fixtures, mending tools and crafting everyday essentials. But as feudal lords began raising armies and castles rose across Europe, something extraordinary happened. The blacksmith's anvil became as vital as the knight's sword. Warfare was changing, chainmail gave way to plate armor, and simple iron blades were no match for the new breeds of weapons needed on the battlefield. Blacksmiths didn't just adapt, they transformed their craft into an art of war. What set this era apart was the sheer pace of innovation. A blacksmith in the 8th century might spend a lifetime making the same reliable farming tools, but by the 12th century, their forge became a laboratory for military technology. They experimented with steel alloys, discovering that folding and tempering metal in precise ways could produce blades that held a razor's edge yet resisted shattering. Armorers learned to tailor-plate steel so it moved with a knight's body rather than weighing them down. These weren't just incremental improvements, they were revolutions that reshaped combat. A well-armored knight could now withstand arrows that would have pierced earlier mail, and a finely balanced sword could turn the tide of a duel. But mastery like this couldn't thrive in isolation. Enter the guild's powerful networks that guarded blacksmithing techniques like state secrets. Becoming a master smith wasn't just about skill, it was a years-long journey through strict apprenticeship tiers. A young boy might start as a bellows worker, sweating to keep the forge fires hot before even touching a hammer. Only after a decade or more of grueling training could he produce his masterpiece, a weapon or suit of armor flawless enough to earn guild approval. These weren't just quality controls, they were the reason European smiths stayed generations ahead of rivals. While other regions had talented metalworkers, the guild system created an unbroken chain of knowledge, each generation refining what the last had perfected. The true measure of their influence, kings and warlords began treating master smiths like treasure. When a castle was besieged, attackers would often demand the surrender of armorers alongside nobles. Some rulers even issued decrees forbidding blacksmiths from leaving their realms, knowing their skills were more valuable than gold. In an age where a single skilled smith could arm an entire garrison, their forges became the unsung strongholds of medieval power. And as we'll soon see, this quiet dominance would ignite innovations that reached far beyond the battlefield, reshaping economies, trade, and even the balance of empires. The forge wasn't just a workshop, it was a battlefield in its own right, where fire and sweat turned raw earth into weapons of war. Every morning began with the roar of bellows driving air into the furnace, temperatures climbing high enough to make iron glow like liquid sunlight. Picture the smith standing before this inferno, his face streaked with ash and sweat as he plunged rough ore into the flames. This was smelting the alchemy that separated metal from rock, a process so vital that armies would cart entire forges with them on campaign. One miscalculation in the fire's heat or the ore's purity, and the metal might crumble like dry clay when struck. Shaping a blade was an act of patience and precision. The smith would draw the glowing metal from the fire, his hammer falling in rhythmic blows, each strike folding the steel upon itself, driving out impurities, weaving strength into the metal's very grain. Some swords required hundreds of these folds, a dance repeated until the steel could hold an edge sharp enough to split a hair yet flexible enough to withstand the shock of combat. Armor demanded even greater artistry. A breastplate wasn't just beaten into shape, it was sculpted to the contours of a knight's body, each curve tested for mobility, each joint articulated like the plates of a living creature. The difference between a hastily made suit and a masterwork could mean a knight fighting freely or struggling beneath a crushing weight. Location turned the forge into a strategic strongpoint. Castles built their armories within the inner wards, protected by towering walls, because losing a smith mid-siege was as disastrous as losing the granary. Traveling forges followed armies like mobile factories, their smoke marking the path of conquest. Commanders knew battles were often won not just by the skill of soldiers, but by the speed at which broken swords could be reforged and dented helmets repaired. In the Crusades, chronicles tell of blacksmiths working through the night before major assaults, their anvils ringing like war drums in the darkness. What's often forgotten is how these workshops buzzed with collaboration. A master smith rarely worked alone. Apprentices fed the fires, journeymen shaped rough blanks, and specialized armorers fitted individual pieces. The forge was a hive of shared knowledge where techniques passed from hand to hand in the glow of the coals. A single campaign might demand arrows by the thousand, horseshoes by the hundred, and fresh spearheads by the dozen. Meeting those needs required not just skill, but logistics worthy of a quartermaster. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in the records of defeated armies. When a castle fell, invaders would often spare the blacksmiths, offering them higher wages rather than chains. Their value was beyond ransom, their craft the invisible thread holding the fabric of warfare together. Long after the last sword was sheathed and the final charge faded into legend, the legacy of those smoky workshops endured in the balanced weight of a surviving broadsword, in the intricate scrollwork of a knight's gauntlet, in the simple fact that centuries later, we still marvel at what their hammers wrought. Among the glowing forges of medieval Europe, certain weapons emerged as game-changers, tools of war so finely crafted, they shifted the balance of power. Take the longsword, a masterpiece of balance and lethality. Unlike earlier blades that sacrificed either strength or sharpness, the longsword's secret lay in its tapered design, thicker near the hilt for parrying blows, thinner toward the tip for lightning-fast strikes. But the real genius was in the pommel, that weighted knob at the sword's end. What seemed like decoration was actually precision engineering, counterbalancing the blade so a knight could swing it for hours without exhaustion. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a testament to how blacksmiths understood the physics of combat down to the ounce. Then there were the Viking Ulfberht swords, relics so advanced they seemed almost mythical. Forged from crucible steel, a technique lost to Europe for centuries after the Roman Empire, these blades bore a mysterious inscription, plus Ulfberht plus T. Their metal contained almost no slag, the brittle impurities that made lesser swords snap mid-battle. Contemporary accounts tell of Ulfberts cleaving through shields and helmets as if they were parchment, leaving enemies convinced their wielders possessed supernatural aid. Modern metallurgists have found that these swords contained carbon levels rivaling modern steel, a feat unmatched for another 800 years. How did Viking smiths achieve this? The answer lies in trade routes stretching to the Middle East, where they acquired high-quality ingots, then combined them with forging methods so secret, even today we can't fully replicate their process. But not all legendary weapons belonged to nobles. The humble spear, often dismissed as a peasant's tool, was the unsung hero of medieval warfare. Cheap to produce yet devastating information, a well-made spearhead could pierce chainmail when swung with enough force. Blacksmiths perfected their design by adding ridges along the blade, a subtle touch that prevented the tip from snapping off inside an opponent's body. Flemish infantry at the Battle of the Golden Spurs proved this in 1302, when their tightly packed spearmen toppled French cavalry, turning the tide with what was essentially a farmer's weapon refined to lethal perfection. Armies soon learned that victory depended as much on the smith's anvil as the soldier's strength. The English longbow's rise, for instance, demanded a revolution in arrowheads. Traditional broadheads were deadly against unarmored foes, but French knights clad in plate armor simply brushed them off. The solution: bodkin points, needle-sharp tips hammered from hardened steel, capable of punching through armor seams. These weren't mass-produced. Each one was hand-forged to a taper thinner than a quill pen, then tempered to resist bending. At Agincourt in 1415, thousands of these arrows darkened the sky, their precision-crafted points finding gaps in armor and toppling the pride of French chivalry. What united these weapons wasn't just their deadliness, but the blacksmith's relentless pursuit of improvement. A sword's fuller groove wasn't just decorative, it lightened the blade without sacrificing strength. A mace's flanged edges weren't arbitrary, they concentrated force to shatter bone beneath armor. Even the humble dagger evolved, with triangular cross-sections designed to slip between ribs. Every curve, every weight distribution, every tempering technique was a silent dialogue between smith and warrior, refined over generations. And when these weapons marched onto the battlefield, they carried more than sharp edges. They carried the ingenuity of those who'd shaped them, one hammer strike at a time. A knight clad head to toe in gleaming steel seems invincible, until you realize that armor wasn't just metal slapped onto a body. It was a feat of engineering, a second skin forged through countless hours at the anvil. Chainmail, the workhorse of early medieval warriors, looked simple at a glance, thousands of interlocking iron rings, but crafting it required a blacksmith's patience bordering on obsession. Each ring had to be individually punched from sheet metal, welded shut, and linked to 4 others in a pattern so precise it could distribute the force of a sword blow across the entire garment. A single hauberk might contain 20,000 rings, each one hammered and fitted by hand. The best mail wasn't just sturdy, it flowed like fabric, allowing a warrior to raise his arms or twist in the saddle without gaps exposing vulnerable flesh. Then came the revolution of plate armor. By the 14th century, blacksmiths had mastered the art of shaping steel into curved plates that could deflect arrows and absorb the shock of mace strikes. But here's where their genius truly shone. A poorly designed suit might as well be a coffin, rigid metal pinning the wearer in place. Master armorers solved this with articulated joints, overlapping plates at the elbows and knees that moved with the body's natural motion. They even accounted for airflow, crafting helmets with breathable visors and ventilation holes to prevent knights from suffocating in their own sweat during battle. The result, a knight in full plate could somersault, mount a horse unaided, or even perform handstands. Myths about clumsiness were just that, myths spread by those who'd never worn a properly fitted suit. The battlefield was the ultimate testing ground. At Agincourt, French knights learned the hard way that armor alone couldn't save them. Their heavy plate, designed for frontal cavalry charges, became a death trap in the muddy mire, weighing them down as English archers picked them off. Blacksmiths took note. Soon, armor adapted lighter designs for infantry, reinforced greaves for those fighting on foot, and specialized, arrow-proof breastplates with subtle ridges to glance off missile fire. Every dent and scratch on a returned suit told a story, guiding smiths to reinforce vulnerable spots or adjust weight distribution. What's often overlooked is how armor reflected status. A king's suit wasn't just functional, it was a walking masterpiece etched with intricate designs, gilded edges, and even hidden compartments for relics. Meanwhile, foot soldiers got munitions armor, standardized pieces produced in bulk, yet still leagues ahead of anything from earlier centuries. This tiered system wasn't just about vanity, it showcased the blacksmith's range. They could craft for the tournament field where showy embellishments dazzled crowds, or for the grim reality of war where simplicity meant survival. The ultimate testament to their skill, armor so trusted that knights would let smiths test it on the spot. Chronicles tell of craftsmen striking finished suits with full force blows to prove their work, the ringing clang a badge of honor. In an era where battle was constant, these metal skins didn't just protect bodies, they carried the reputation of the hands that made them. And when a knight rode into battle, it wasn't just his courage that determined his fate, but the silent partnership with the blacksmith who'd turned raw ore into a shield of steel. Behind every gleaming suit of armor and every razor-sharp blade lay an economic engine that powered kingdoms. The medieval blacksmith didn't just shape metal, they shaped markets, trade networks, and even the fate of nations. Consider this, the cost to fully equip a single knight often exceeded the lifetime earnings of a dozen peasants. A high-quality suit of plate armor could fetch the equivalent of a small farm, while a finely balanced sword might cost as much as a craftsman's yearly wages. These weren't just weapons and armor, they were investments, status symbols, and sometimes the difference between a kingdom's survival or collapse. The scramble for resources turned blacksmiths into geopolitical players. Iron ore deposits became as coveted as gold mines, with rulers waging wars to control them. Sweden's vast iron reserves, for example, bankrolled its military ambitions for centuries, while the Rhineland's rich deposits made it a battleground for competing empires. But raw ore was useless without the skill to transform it. Master smiths were so valuable that kings would offer tax exemptions, land grants, even noble titles to lure them. In 1284, King Edward I of England went so far as to issue a decree forbidding armorers from working abroad. fearing their expertise might fall into rival hands. Trade routes stretched across continents to feed the demand for superior steel. Venetian merchants smuggled Damascus steel ingots from the Middle East, while Russian fur traders bartered for Norse iron along frozen rivers. The finest sword blades often began as raw materials from opposite ends of the known world. Norwegian iron for its purity, combined with carbon-rich alloys from the Caucasus to create steel that could outlast lesser weapons. This globalized trade wasn't just about quality, it was about necessity. Local forges simply couldn't produce enough metal to equip entire armies, leading to supply chains more complex than many realized. Shortages could spark disasters. During the 100 Years' War, French chronicles tell of knights fighting in patched-together armor after English blockades cut off iron shipments. Some resorted to wearing layered quilting as makeshift protection, a far cry from the gleaming plate of legend. Conversely, kingdoms with stable metal supplies held overwhelming advantages. The Hussite rebels in Bohemia turned plowshares into war wagons armored with recycled metal, outmaneuvering better-funded foes through sheer resourcefulness. Perhaps the most revealing detail lies in royal account books. The English Exchequer's records show that King Henry V spent more on arrowheads for the Agincourt campaign than on wages for his entire army. Every horseshoe, every dagger, every rivet in a helmet represented not just military might, but cold, hard currency. Blacksmiths sat at the center of this economy, their forges functioning as banks where metal held greater value than coin. When a kingdom's treasury ran low, it wasn't gold reserves that determined its fate. It was how quickly the smiths could turn ore into arms. This economic web extended beyond warfare. The same forges producing swords also crafted the tools that built cities' plows to feed populations, nails for shipbuilding, hinges for castle gates. A skilled smith could uplift an entire region's prosperity, attracting other craftsmen and trade. Towns like Solingen in Germany and Toledo in Spain became synonymous with quality metalwork, their names stamped on blades as a mark of prestige centuries later. The true measure of their influence, when the Black Death wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, blacksmiths were among the few whose wages didn't just rise, they skyrocketed. While fields lay fallow and shops closed, the demand for weapons and tools remained insatiable. Armorers could name their price, and kings paid it without hesitation. In the end, the medieval world understood a simple truth: control the metal, control the smiths, and you controlled the future. The anvil's ring wasn't just the sound of craftsmanship, it was the heartbeat of an empire. When castles loomed on the horizon and armies dug in for months-long sieges, victory often hinged on a blacksmith's ability to turn scrap metal into game-changing tools. Picture the scene. Outside the castle walls, smiths hammered relentlessly under makeshift tents, forging the iron skeletons of catapults and trebuchets. Each of these monstrous machines demanded hundreds of precisely crafted components, not just the obvious throwing arms, but the hidden linchpins that held tension, the chains that anchored counterweights, even the metal bands preventing wooden frames from splitting under stress. A single poorly forged bolt could spell disaster, sending a siege engine collapsing mid-launch. Inside the besieged fortress, another team of smiths worked feverishly to counter these threats. Their anvils rang with defensive innovations, hinges for reinforced gates that could withstand battering rams, iron grills to drop over breached entrances, even caltrops, four-pointed metal spikes scattered to cripple charging horses. The same forge that produced arrowheads for archers on the walls might also craft surgical tools for the infirmary, proving that blacksmiths were the ultimate multitaskers in times of crisis. The contrast between offensive and defensive metalwork reveals a fascinating duality. Battering rams, for instance, needed iron tips heavy enough to splinter oak gates yet soft enough not to shatter on impact, a balance achieved by layering different steel alloys. Meanwhile, castle defenders installed murder holes above gateways, their iron trapdoors operated by hidden mechanisms that dropped boiling oil or stones onto attackers. Both sides relied on the same fundamental skills, yet each application required opposite strategies. Some of the most ingenious creations were born from scarcity. During the siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266, defenders reportedly melted down church bells to forge extra projectiles when supplies ran low. Conversely, besieging armies sometimes repurposed captured farming tools into siege hooks for scaling walls. This adaptability turned blacksmiths into battlefield MacGyvers, improvising solutions under crushing deadlines. The true unsung heroes, the nails. Thousands held a single trebuchet together, each one hand forged to exact specifications. Too brittle and vibration would snap them, too soft and weight would bend them. Modern reconstructions of medieval siege engines reveal that their metal fittings weren't crude afterthoughts, they were precision components, often interchangeable between machines like parts in a factory. This standardization hints at an organized system of production, where blacksmiths worked from shared templates centuries before industrialization. Perhaps no invention showcases their strategic brilliance like the portable forge. Chronicles describe mobile units trailing siege armies, their bellows puffing like battlefield lungs. These roving workshops could repair armor overnight, sharpen blunted weapons at dawn, and fabricate replacement parts by noon, all while under threat of attack. When Richard the Lionheart besieged Acre, his smiths reportedly kept siege towers functional despite constant Greek fire attacks, their hammers never falling silent. In the end, sieges weren't won by brute strength alone, but by the relentless ingenuity of those who mastered fire and iron. Every creaking siege tower that reached a wall, every gate that held against assault, every flaming arrow that found its mark, they all carried the fingerprints of blacksmiths who understood that warfare wasn't just about force, but about the marriage of metal and imagination. Long after the armies dispersed, the legacy of their work endured in the twisted iron remnants littering abandoned battlefields, silent witnesses to the craft that built and broke empires. Hidden in the glow of the forge were techniques so closely guarded, they might as well have been state secrets. Take pattern welding, a method so intricate it turned steel into art. Smiths would twist and fold multiple iron rods, welding them together in layers, then etch the blade with acid to reveal swirling patterns resembling flowing water or rippling grain. These weren't just decorative, the alternating layers of hard and soft steel created blades that could hold a razor's edge while resisting shattering. The legendary swords of the Franks, with their distinctive, serpentine designs, weren't just weapons. They were advertisements of a smith's mastery, instantly recognizable on the battlefield. Then there was the mystery of differential hardening, a process that bordered on alchemy. By coating parts of a red-hot blade in clay before quenching it in water or oil, smiths could create zones of varying hardness, a razor-sharp edge backed by a spine flexible enough to absorb shocks. Japanese katana makers called this the hamon, the visible temper line that became a sword's fingerprint. But European smiths had their own versions, like the German waveless hardening, where the exact clay mixture and quenching timing were family secrets passed down only to heirs. Get it wrong and the blade might warp or crack. Get it right and you'd crafted a weapon that could cleave through lesser blades like fire through parchment. The length smiths went to protect these methods were extraordinary. In Damascus, the secret of crucible steel producing ingots with near-mythical purity was so coveted that workshops were built without windows and apprentices swore blood oaths of silence. When the Crusaders captured Syrian armories, they found stacks of gleaming blades but no trace of how they were made. Even the famous Ulfberht swords with their cryptic inscriptions may have been a sort of medieval trademark, a way for master smiths to claim credit without revealing their techniques. Rival kingdoms didn't just admire these weapons, they stole them, literally. Spanish chronicles tell of Castilian agents infiltrating Moorish forges in Toledo, bribing workers for fragments of recipes. The Venetians went further, passing laws that granted asylum to any foreign smith who defected with metallurgical knowledge. In 1520, the Duke of Milan reportedly sent assassins after a French armorer who'd been lured across the Alps, not to kill him, but to drag him back mid-journey. Knowledge was power, and in an age where a superior sword could decide battles, metallurgy became as strategic as troop movements. Some secrets vanished forever. The blood grooves often seen on medieval blades weren't, as myth claims, channels for gore. They were fullers, carefully placed to lighten the weapon without sacrificing strength. But how smiths calculated their exact placement, or why some swords sang with a clear tone when struck, remains lost to time. When the last master of a technique died without an heir, it could take centuries to rediscover. Modern blacksmiths still struggle to replicate the resilience of a Viking-era seeks, its steel somehow flexible and unyielding at once. What's striking is how these methods crossed cultural lines. The samurai's folded steel and the Norse twist-core spears used startlingly similar principles, despite oceans between them. Great minds, it seems, reached for the same solutions when lives hung in the balance. Yet for all their ingenuity, the true masterpiece of these smiths wasn't just the weapons they left behind. It was the culture of innovation they forged, where every hammer strike carried the weight of centuries of trial, error, and sometimes brilliance taken to the grave. In the flickering light of the forge, where fire transformed earth into weapons, blacksmiths weren't just craftsmen, they were seen as conduits of the divine. Across cultures, their ability to bend metal to their will seemed almost supernatural, earning them a place in myth and legend. The Greeks worshipped Hephaestus, the lame god of the forge, whose workshop beneath Mount Olympus produced armor for heroes like Achilles. Norse sagas spoke of Whale and the smith, a figure so skilled he could fashion wings to escape captivity. His story whispered around campfires from Scandinavia to England. These weren't just tales, they reflected a deep-seated belief that blacksmiths operated at the boundary between the mortal world and something far greater. Rituals surrounded their work like smoke around the anvil. Before quenching a newly forged blade, some smiths would plunge it into water mixed with holy relics or the blood of a sacrificial animal, believing this would transfer strength or protection to the metal. In medieval Europe, swords destined for kings might be etched with runes or prayers, their hilts wrapped in parchment inscribed with psalms. The famed sword in the stone legend may have roots in this tradition, a weapon imbued with mystical qualities, waiting for the rightful hand to wield it. Even the act of naming a blade, like Charlemagne's Joyeuse or the mythical Excalibur, wasn't mere vanity. It was an invocation, a way to bind the weapon's spirit to its purpose. The superstitions ran deeper than ceremony. Many believed a blacksmith's touch could heal as well as harm. Horseshoes nailed above doors to ward off evil weren't just iron. They were iron shaped by a smith's hands, carrying residual power from the forge. In some regions, parents brought sick children to be passed over the anvil, trusting the smith's connection to elemental forces. Battlefields amplified these beliefs. Soldiers swore that blades forged during a waxing moon struck truer, or that armor made on certain saints' days turned aside arrows as if guided by invisible hands. This reverence wasn't blind faith, it grew from observable reality. When two swords clashed and one shattered while the other held firm, what else could explain it but divine favor? When a smith produced a blade that seemed to glow faintly in dim light, a trick of superior steel polishing, it was easy to see it as blessed. The finest smiths leaned into this mystique, cultivating an aura of secrecy. Some wore amulets filled with forge soot as talismans. Others refused to work unless certain planetary alignments were right, reinforcing the idea that their craft required cosmic harmony. The paradox is striking. While blacksmiths relied on precise physics, the carbon content of steel, the exact temperature for tempering, their reputation thrived on mystery. A master smith might spend years perfecting the angle of a hammer strike, only to credit his success to a whispered incantation. This duality made them indispensable. Kings sought their skills but also their blessings, trusting that a sword forged under ritual would carry more than sharpness into battle, it would carry destiny. Long after the fires cooled, this legacy endured, not just in the weapons left behind, but in the enduring image of the smith as a figure who didn't just shape metal, but fate itself. The image of a medieval blacksmith, muscled arms, soot-streaked face, hammer ringing against steel, has long been dominated by men in popular imagination. But history's forges held secrets far more diverse than we've been taught. Meet Agnes Hotot, a name that should echo as loudly as any legendary swordsmith. When her father fell ill in 14th century England, unable to fulfill an armor contract for a local noble, Agnes didn't just keep the forge fires burning, she donned his apron, took up his tools, and finished the order herself. And she didn't stop there. When a rival smith challenged her work, questioning whether a woman could produce battle-ready armor, Agnes did something extraordinary. She strapped on the very suit she'd crafted, mounted a horse, and unhorsed her detractor in a jousting match, proving the metal's worth with her own body. The crowd erupted not just at her skill, but at the audacity of a woman besting a man in his own domain. Agnes was far from alone. Guild records across Europe tell of women like Floretta La Forgeress in Paris, who inherited her husband's workshop in 1382 and expanded it into one of the city's largest suppliers of arrowheads. In Frankfurt, the widow Claude Kuusnerin legally fought for, and won, the right to train apprentices after her metalworker husband's death, arguing that her years of labor beside him made her as qualified as any man. These weren't exceptions, they were part of a hidden network of female metalworkers who kept armies equipped while navigating a world determined to erase their contributions. Why does this matter? Because warfare wasn't just shaped by those who swung swords, it was shaped by those who made them. Women often handled the precision work requiring meticulous attention, sewing chainmail rings so tight they could deflect dagger thrusts, etching delicate engravings on noble clients' armor, or tempering blades at exact temperatures passed down through generations. Some of the finest surviving examples of medieval mail bear hallmarks suggesting female craftsmanship, their rings smaller and more uniformly spaced than mass-produced versions, creating flexibility without sacrificing protection. The obstacles they faced were as hard as the steel they worked. Guild statutes frequently barred women from official membership, forcing them to operate under male relatives' names or work unofficially as silent partners. Yet tax rolls tell a different story. In York, Mistress Johanna the smith paid higher levies than half the male smiths combined, her workshop producing everything from plowshares to poleaxe heads. In Venice, court documents reveal women like Lucia the armorer negotiating directly with naval commanders for shipments of rivets and breastplates. Their success wasn't accidental, it was born of necessity. When wars drained towns of men, women didn't just mourn, they stepped into the gaps, keeping essential trades alive. Perhaps the most poignant evidence lies in the artifacts themselves. A recently discovered 15th century helmet in Austria bears an inscription inside its brim, not the maker's mark but a prayer in delicate script, "God protect Hans, my love." Forensic analysis suggests the engraving was done by the smith's wife, her touch lingering where only the wearer would feel it. These intimate details remind us that behind every suit of armor, there was often a woman's hand, not just as a helper, but as a creator. Their legacy isn't written in guild ledgers or celebrated in songs, but it's there in the very metal that shaped history's battles, and that's a story worth hammering into the light. In the rigid world of medieval feudalism, where birthright determined your place, blacksmiths occupied a rare and fascinating space, a social tightrope between worlds. They weren't nobles commanding armies, yet no lord dared treat them as common peasants. Their hands held something more valuable than land or titles, the power to arm or disarm an entire region. This unique status earned them privileges unheard of for most craftsmen. In 12th century England, royal charters granted smiths exemption from tolls when traveling to fairs, recognizing that their trade routes were lifelines for military supply chains. French lords often waived the corvée, the back-breaking labor dues owed by peasants, for local smiths, because why waste a metalworker's time digging ditches when he could be forging spearheads? What truly set them apart was their mobility. While serfs were bound to the land, a master smith could pack his tools and leave if a better offer came, and rulers knew it. Chronicles from the Holy Roman Empire tell of dukes gifting blacksmiths with parcels of land, not as feudal obligations, but as incentives to stay. In Italy, city-states competed to attract armorers by offering citizenship, rights typically reserved for merchants or nobles. These weren't just perks, they were calculated investments. A single skilled smith could mean the difference between a garrison equipped with rusted scrap and one wielding weapons that could hold a castle for months. Their leverage extended into politics. During the Barons' revolt against King John of England, rebel lords specifically targeted royal armories, not just to seize weapons, but to capture the smiths working there. Conversely, when Henry III sought to crush the rebellion, his first act wasn't to raise more troops, it was to issue a decree promising doubled wages to any smith who relocated to his loyal strongholds. The message was clear: control the metalworkers and you controlled the war. Yet this influence came with razor-thin margins. Smiths walked a delicate line, dependent on noble patronage but vulnerable to shifting alliances. When the Burgundians sacked Liege in 1468, they didn't just loot the forges, they forcibly relocated hundreds of armorers to Dijon, treating them as living war prizes. Other smiths played the system brilliantly, like those in Toledo who played Christian and Moorish rulers against each other, securing protections from both sides by hinting they might share metallurgical secrets with the enemy. The most revealing glimpse into their social paradox lies in surviving guild records. In Strasbourg, smiths were fined for wearing silk, a fabric reserved for nobility, yet the same documents show them dining with counts and bishops. They inhabited a world where skill trumped bloodline, where a perfectly tempered sword could earn a commoner audiences with kings. This wasn't just upward mobility, it was a quiet rewriting of feudal rules, one hammer strike at a time. Long after castles crumbled, their legacy endured in the unspoken truth of medieval power, that those who control the means of destruction wield influence no crown could ignore. The clang of hammers echoed far beyond local forges, carried along trade routes that stretched from the deserts of Damascus to the fjords of Scandinavia. When Crusader knights first crossed paths with Saracen warriors in the Holy Land, they weren't just encountering enemies, they were confronting weapons that seemed forged by sorcery. Damascus steel blades could slice through European swords like parchment, their surfaces shimmering with watery patterns that spoke of techniques unknown in the West. These weren't just superior weapons, they were living proof that metallurgical knowledge traveled faster than armies. Returning crusaders didn't just bring relics, they smuggled fragments of steel ingots, sometimes even kidnapping skilled smiths from defeated cities. The siege of Antioch in 1098 saw Norman soldiers specifically targeting Armenian metalworkers, offering them fortunes to defect. The Silk Road became an iron highway for technological espionage. Persian manuscripts describe Chinese merchants hiding steel recipes in hollowed-out camel bones, while Venetian traders paid in gold for fragments of Central Asian crucible steel. In the bazaars of Samarkand, one could find Norse dagger designs alongside Mongolian arrowheads, their shapes subtly influencing each other over generations. The Vikings didn't just raid for silver, they sought out Rhineland smiths to learn advanced pattern welding, then carried those techniques to Dublin's workshops, where Celtic and Norse methods blended into something entirely new. Some exchanges were brutally direct. When Mongol hordes sacked Kiev in 1240, they left the churches standing but burned every forge to the ground, after first documenting their layouts and tools. Chinese records reveal Kublai Khan's engineers reverse engineering captured European crossbows, adapting their steel trigger mechanisms for Eastern designs. Meanwhile, Spanish Reconquista armies adopted the famed Toledo steel techniques from the very Moorish smiths they'd driven out, proving that knowledge often outlived empires. The most fascinating transfers happened in plain sight. Pilgrim routes to Santiago de Compostela doubled as smuggling networks for metallurgical secrets, with traveling monks hiding steel samples in reliquaries. Jewish metalsmiths expelled from Spain brought advanced quenching techniques to Ottoman lands, where they merged with Arabic methods to create Wootz steel, the ancestor of Damascus blades. Even the humble horseshoe tells a story of stolen innovation. The curved design we recognize today originated with steppe nomads, was perfected by Byzantine armorers, then spread westward by Hungarian traders. This underground exchange of knowledge reshaped battlefields more decisively than any single conquest. When English longbowmen faced French knights at Agincourt, they were wielding arrows tipped with steel refined by German methods, learned from Italian traders who'd acquired the secrets from Byzantine refugees. The weapons that built and broke kingdoms weren't just tools of war, they were living libraries, their very metal whispering the combined wisdom of continents. High above the battlefields, in the vaulted ceilings of Europe's great cathedrals, another kind of masterpiece was taking shape, one held together by the same hands that forged swords and armor. The blacksmith's craft wasn't confined to warfare, it lifted civilization itself skyward, just as cathedral builders transformed stone into lacework with flying buttresses and pointed arches. Smiths performed their own miracles in iron, crafting the hidden skeletons that allowed these stone giants to defy gravity. The ribs of a Gothic vault, the delicate tracery of a rose window's support, none of it would have been possible without the metalwork binding it all together. Consider Notre Dame de Paris, where slender iron rods embedded in the masonry allowed walls to rise thinner and taller than ever before. These weren't mere reinforcements, they were precision instruments, each rod forged to exact lengths and tensile strengths to counteract the outward thrust of the vaults. Modern laser scans reveal something astonishing. The cathedral's original 13th century ironwork was strategically placed at stress points modern engineers would target today. The smiths who shaped these bars understood forces they couldn't yet measure, their knowledge etched in fire and hammer strokes rather than mathematical formulas. The parallels between smiths and master builders run deep. Both worked in collectives, masons shaping stone alongside smiths bending iron, their collaboration blurring the line between art and engineering. When Chartres Cathedral's spire pierced the clouds in the 1200s, its iron spire reinforcement was a feat rivaling any suit of tournament armor. The same techniques that made a knight's plate armor articulate and light, careful tapering, judicious use of alloys were applied to the wrought iron bands encircling columns or the chains preventing bell towers from shaking apart in high winds. Peacetime innovations often outpaced wartime ones. The iron tie rods spanning Amiens Cathedral's nave, invisible to worshippers below, were tensioned with screw mechanisms so advanced they wouldn't reappear in Europe for another 3 centuries. Blacksmiths adapted their battlefield joinery, the same methods used to hinge siege engines, to create collapsible scaffolding that could be hoisted ever upward as construction progressed. Even the tools changed. Cathedral forges developed specialized hammers with rounded faces to avoid marring decorative ironwork, a refinement borrowed back by armorers crafting tournament helms with intricate engraving. The true testament to their legacy, many of these medieval iron supports still hold firm after 800 years, while modern replacements rust away in decades. The secret lay in the smith's understanding of material purity. Just as they selected the cleanest ores for sword cores, cathedral iron came from bogs where cold, oxygen-poor water produced metal with fewer impurities. Some rods even show evidence of being quenched in vinegar, a trick armorers used to prevent brittleness, proving how fluidly knowledge crossed between sacred and secular forges. What's often overlooked is how these projects became incubators for social change. Cathedral construction employed smiths from rival regions, forcing them to share techniques under truce. The iron reinforcements of Reims Cathedral, for example, bear metallurgical signatures tracing to at least 6 different forging traditions, their differences resolved through trial and error. In an age of constant warfare, these soaring monuments became neutral ground where the free exchange of ideas built something greater than the sum of its parts. The next time you stand beneath the stained glass glow of a Gothic masterpiece, look closer. Those slender iron filaments threading through the stone are more than engineering. They're the quiet signature of the same hands that armed knights and stopped armies. The blacksmith's true genius lay in knowing that whether shaping a sword or a spire, the principles remained the same. Understand the material, respect its limits, and with enough skill, you could make the impossible stand tall. The billowing smoke of medieval forges didn't just signal industry, it marked the beginning of humanity's first large-scale environmental trade-offs. Every sword, every nail, every horseshoe came at a cost measured in ravaged forests and poisoned streams. To fuel a single smithy's furnace for a year required clearing acres of ancient woodland, as charcoal became the lifeblood of metal production. Oak and beech trees that had taken centuries to grow vanished in weeks, reduced to smoldering piles in earth-mound kilns. The demand was staggering. Records from Burgundy in the 1300s show one ducal armory consuming enough charcoal to deforest 30 square miles annually. Whole landscapes were transformed, with regions like the Ardennes and the Black Forest earning their names from the charred remains of relentless fuel gathering. But deforestation was just the start. The runoff from Bloomery's primitive furnaces where ore was smelted turned nearby rivers acidic with iron oxide and heavy metals. Fish kills downstream of mining towns became so common they barely warranted mention in local chronicles. In England's Weald region, where iron production thrived, the soil still bears elevated lead levels from centuries of slag dumping. The very innovations that made weapons deadlier also amplified ecological harm. The shift to water-powered bellows in the 1200s, while increasing furnace temperatures for better steel also concentrated pollution near rivers, wiping out entire freshwater ecosystems that medieval communities relied upon. Faced with these mounting costs, blacksmiths became early practitioners of circular economies. Battlefields doubled as recycling centers, with scavengers hauling shattered swords, broken arrowheads, and dented armor back to forges to be melted down. The famous sword found embedded in Westminster Abbey's coronation chair, metallurgical analysis reveals it was reforged from at least 3 different weapons, their original alloys blended through skilled remelting. Siege sites yielded particularly rich pickings after the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. Polish smiths reportedly recovered enough scrap metal to arm 2 additional regiments. Even household waste found new purpose. Rusted hinges, broken plowshares, and discarded cooking pots were routinely tossed into the crucible, their impurities burned away to create serviceable metal. The most ingenious adaptations emerged from sheer necessity. When Swedish iron mines became waterlogged, smiths developed the Osmond process, small, portable furnaces that could extract iron from low-grade ore with minimal fuel. In the resource-starved Scottish Highlands, armorers mixed bog iron with crushed seashells to create a passable steel substitute, while Venetian smiths stretched their precious Damascus steel imports by welding them to cheaper local cores. These weren't just technical solutions, they reflected a growing awareness that metal couldn't be conjured endlessly from the earth. The echoes of this struggle resonate today. Modern archaeologists can trace the rise and fall of medieval armories through pollen samples, layers of charcoal dust, giving way to regrown forests as wars ended and forges fell silent. It's a reminder that every leap in military technology, from tempered steel to gunpowder, carried hidden consequences. The blacksmiths who armed kingdoms also unwittingly wrote one of history's first lessons in unsustainable industry, their anvils ringing a warning we're still learning to heed. When the torches of rebellion flared across medieval Europe, it was often the glow of a blacksmith's forge that kept them burning. Take the English peasants' revolt of 1381, where an army of commoners marched on London, not with pitchforks, but with professionally forged weapons, axes sharp enough to splinter castle gates, bills designed to hook knights from their saddles, even makeshift cannons hammered from stolen church bells. These weren't crude tools repurposed for violence. They were instruments of war crafted by smiths who'd spent lifetimes arming the very lords their neighbors now rose against. The rebellion's leader, Wat Tyler, reportedly had a former royal armorer in his ranks, a man who turned his knowledge of forged steel against the crown that had underpaid him for years. The Flemish revolts tell an even darker tale. In 1302, when cloth workers and farmers rose up against French rule, their secret weapon wasn't just numbers, it was the guild-trained smiths of Bruges and Ghent. These metalworkers had spent years crafting pikes for city militias, but when the call came, they retooled their forges overnight. The French knights at the Battle of the Golden Spurs learned the hard way what organized peasants could do with properly tempered steel. Their polished armor, made by royal smiths, proved no match for the thick, wedge-shaped spearheads designed by rebels who understood exactly where plate armor had weak points. Not all rebel smiths acted from idealism. Some were coerced, like those during the Jacquerie uprising in France, where peasant mobs dragged armorers from their workshops at sword point. Others saw opportunity. The German Peasants' War of 1524 saw mercenary smiths selling services to both sides, their loyalty measured in silver. But the most fascinating cases were the quiet resistors. In the Scottish Highlands, clan smiths famously crafted dirks and broadswords under the noses of English occupiers, hiding forges in caves and smuggling finished blades inside bundles of wool. One surviving example, the Glencoe dirk, bears a maker's mark identical to those found on weapons issued to English garrisons, proof that some smiths armed both oppressor and oppressed from the same anvil. The authorities knew the danger these artisans posed. After the Hussite Wars, Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund ordered every village smith within 50 miles of Prague to swear an oath never to forge war scythes again. In England, King Henry IV made it treason for smiths to sell weapons to men of low estate without noble permission. Yet the rebellions kept coming because no decree could erase a simple truth. The same hands that shod a lord's horses could just as easily shoe the hooves of revolution. Perhaps the most poignant symbol lies in the ruins of Montségur, last stronghold of the Cathar heretics. When the fortress fell in 1244, inquisitors meticulously recorded every weapon found except the smith's tools. Those vanished into the Pyrenees, carried away by apprentices who'd later resurface in other rebellions, other causes. Because while castles could be razed and armies disbanded, the knowledge to arm the powerless was a spark no siege could extinguish. In the end, the anvil's greatest power wasn't just shaping metal, it was reshaping the very balance of who got to wield it. The Black Death didn't just empty villages, it silenced forges. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-1400s, it hit blacksmiths with brutal precision. These were men who worked in close quarters, their lungs already scarred by years of inhaling coal dust and metal fumes, making them tragically vulnerable to the pestilence. Guild records from Florence tell of entire workshops wiped out in weeks, their anvils cold for the first time in generations. In London, the Worshipful Company of Blacksmiths lost nearly half its members in a single year, leaving armor contracts for the 100 Years' War unfilled and castles scrambling to repair damaged weapons. The devastation was so complete that some towns resorted to melting down church bells just to patch together enough metal for basic tools. But the plague's impact went deeper than lost lives. It shattered centuries of carefully guarded knowledge. Master smiths often died before passing on their techniques, taking secrets of tempering and alloying to the grave. In Milan, the Visconti family panicked when their prized armorers succumbed, offering double wages to any surviving smith who could replicate their legendary lightweight plate. The scarcity of skilled hands created a bizarre economic paradox. While most laborers saw wages plummet due to surplus workers, blacksmiths' pay skyrocketed. A smith in Ghent could suddenly demand 3 times his pre-plague rate, and lords had no choice but to pay because without weapons, their power was just empty title. Necessity became the mother of reinvention. With traditional apprenticeship systems collapsing, survivors developed startling shortcuts. Water-powered trip hammers, once rare, now proliferated along rivers, allowing one smith to do the work of 3. Standardized measurements emerged no time for custom fittings when death loomed, giving birth to the first mass-produced armor components. The iconic munitions armor of the late Middle Ages, with its interchangeable plates and simplified designs, wasn't just cheaper, it was a direct response to plague-era labor shortages. Even the humble nail changed as smiths adopted drawn wire techniques from the Middle East to speed production. The most profound shift was social. With so many masters dead, guilds reluctantly opened their doors to outsiders. Young men who'd never endure a traditional decade-long apprenticeship now learned through crash courses. Women, often barred from smithing, stepped into vacant workshops to keep family businesses alive. In Paris, tax rolls show a surge in female-headed forgers after the plague, their work ranging from horseshoes to helmet repairs. The old hierarchies crumbled, and in their place rose something more fluid, more desperate, and ultimately more innovative. When the dust settled, the survivors carried forward not just their craft, but a hard-won lesson. That crisis could forge resilience as surely as fire shaped steel. The very techniques that emerged from this darkest hour standardization, labor-saving tools, cross-training, would later fuel the workshops of the Renaissance and beyond. The plague had stolen much, but it couldn't extinguish the spark of ingenuity that kept the hammers ringing. And in that stubborn persistence lay the true legacy of those who survived, the ones who kept the fires burning when the world seemed determined to snuff them out. The rhythmic hammer strikes that once defined Europe's battle preparations began to falter as smoke of a different kind darkened the horizon gunpowder. By the 1600s, the painstakingly crafted longswords and articulated plate armor that had dominated warfare for centuries were no match for the crude but devastating power of muskets and cannon. A single volley from ranks of peasant conscripts could now topple knights who'd spent a lifetime mastering weapons forged over months by master smiths. The economics of war shifted overnight. Where a village might pool resources to equip one armored rider, the same funds could arm 50-foot soldiers with matchlocks. Kings no longer measured military might in the quality of blades, but in the quantity of lead balls their factories could produce. Yet the transition wasn't as sudden as history often paints it. Early firearms were wildly unreliable, prone to misfiring in rain, exploding in users' hands, or failing to pierce the very armor they were meant to obsolete. Savvy blacksmiths seized this liminal moment. In Augsburg, armorers began producing proofed breastplates with distinctive bullet dents near the neck, demonstrating they'd been tested against firearms. Others reinvented themselves as gunsmiths, applying their knowledge of metal behavior to improve barrel forging techniques, the spiral grooves inside rifle barrels that gave bullets deadly accuracy. Those were the brainchild of smiths who'd spent lifetimes perfecting sword fullers to direct stress along a blade's spine. The real tragedy unfolded in the countryside. Village smiths who'd once shod horses and mended plows found their skills increasingly irrelevant as cheap, mass-produced goods flooded markets. The rise of blast furnaces and rolling mills meant nails and hinges no longer needed individual crafting. In England, the old forests that had fed charcoal-hungry forgers were now being cleared for sheep pastures, severing the ancient link between smiths and their fuel sources. By 1700, many rural workshops stood silent, their anvils repurposed as doorstops or plow weights. But not all traditions vanished. In Solingen and Toledo, guilds clung stubbornly to their legacy, producing ceremonial swords for officers who still romanticized the age of chivalry. These weren't battlefield tools but status symbols, their watered steel and gilded hilts echoing a fading ideal. Meanwhile, the Japanese samurai class facing their own gunpowder revolution turned sword-making into a spiritual art, preserving techniques that would later fascinate industrial-age collectors. The most poignant survivors were the armorers of Nuremberg, who pivoted to crafting exquisite firearms for nobility. Their wheel-like pistols became marvels of miniaturization, with mechanisms as finely tuned as clockwork, proof that the old mastery of hands could coexist with the new age of machines. Yet even they couldn't stem the tide. When the 30 Years' War erupted, armies demanded not hundreds of guns but tens of thousands, and no guild could scale to meet that hunger. What endured wasn't the products but the mindset. The same relentless innovation that had once perfected the crossbow's steel trigger resurfaced in early factories, where Smith turned, foremen taught engineers how to temper metal for steam engine parts. The precision required to forge a knight's articulated elbow joint found new purpose in the pistons of industrial looms, and perhaps most fittingly, the blacksmith's bellows, once used to stoke sword-making fires, evolved into the blast furnaces that would forge the modern world. The age of handcrafted arms had ended, but the spirit of those who shaped it lived on, not in the weapons left behind, but in the very bones of the civilization they helped build. Legends whisper of blacksmiths whose skill crossed into the realm of magic, where hammer blows shaped not just steel but destiny itself. Among these mythic figures, none burns brighter than Siegfried, the dragon-slaying hero of Germanic sagas. His sword Bamung wasn't merely forged, it was born from betrayal and resurrection. The tales tell of the smith mime who murdered Siegfried's father and tried to craft a weapon unbreakable enough to kill the boy when he came seeking vengeance. But the young hero, sensing the treachery, reforged the blade himself, tempering it in dragon's blood and his own fury. When Bamung finally met the dragon Fafnir's scales, it didn't just pierce them, it sang through the beast like wind through grass, proving that a smith's intent could imbue metal with something beyond mere sharpness. Then there's Arthur's Excalibur, a legend that twists the blacksmith's role into something divine. Unlike Siegfried's hands-on forging, Arthur's sword emerges ready-made from stone and lake, yet its power still hinges on craftsmanship. The Lady of the Lake, often depicted in medieval art with tools at her waist, isn't just a mystical figure, she's the ultimate armorer, gifting a blade no mortal smith could replicate. Later versions of the tale even show Merlin tutoring young Arthur in metallurgy, suggesting that true kingship required understanding the secrets of the forge. The sword's eventual return to the waters completes the cycle, framing blacksmithing not as a human invention, but as a sacred trust between mortals and the elements. These stories shared an uncanny consistency across cultures. Finnish epics told of Ilmarinen, the eternal smith who hammered the sky itself into being before crafting a magical mill that brought prosperity. Norse skalds sang of Valand, the crippled smith king who fashioned wings to escape captivity, his workshop strewn with the skulls of those who'd wronged him. Even the Bible's Tubal-Cain, the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, was said to have taught humanity both metalworking and warfare. What united these myths wasn't just the marvel of transformation or to weapon, but the recurring idea that shaping metal meant shaping fate. The darker side of these legends reveals ancient anxieties. Smiths in folklore often paid terrible prices for their mastery. Wael, and the smith, star of Anglo-Saxon poetry, was hamstrung and enslaved by a jealous king. His genius turned to crafting treasures for his captors until his grisly revenge. Greek cyclopes, though monstrous, were master metalworkers doomed to serve the gods, a cautionary metaphor for how societies both revered and feared those who controlled such power. These weren't just campfire tales. They reflected real medieval tensions between artisans and the nobility who depended on, yet distrusted, their irreplaceable skills. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in how these stories evolved. Early versions focused on the smith's labor, the hours of folding steel, the ritual of quenching. But as centuries passed, the emphasis shifted to the moment of gifting or discovery. Excalibur isn't celebrated for its forging, but for emerging whole from stone or water. This subtle change mirrors history's erasure of actual blacksmiths, their painstaking work overshadowed by the warriors who wielded their creations. Yet the legends endure, reminding us that behind every mythic sword was a real craftsperson whose skill seemed so extraordinary, it had to be explained as supernatural. The true magic wasn't in the metal, it was in the hands that shaped it. Beneath the English countryside in 2009, a metal detector's chirp unearthed more than treasure. It revealed a time capsule of blacksmithing genius. The Staffordshire Hoard, a trove of over 3,000 gold and silver fragments, wasn't just loot buried by fleeing warriors. Each twisted clasp and shattered hilt was a Rosetta Stone of lost techniques, waiting for modern tools to decode their secrets. Take one gilded sword pommel, its surface scarred by centuries underground. To the untrained eye, it's a battered relic, but under electron microscopes, its metal whispered stories, traces of mercury gilding so precise it defied medieval toolmaking assumptions, and a carbon content suggesting the blade was forged from ore hauled hundreds of miles. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a testament to trade networks and craftsmanship stretching across kingdoms. Metallurgists soon made even more startling discoveries. Some fragments showed evidence of pattern welding, a technique thought to have vanished centuries earlier, where rods of iron and steel were twisted, forged, and folded like dough to create blades both flexible and lethal. Others revealed selective hardening, where smiths used clay coatings to create blades with razor-sharp edges and shock-absorbing spines, a process modern knife makers would only rediscover in the 1900s. The real revelation came from X-ray fluorescence scans, which detected minute traces of nickel and cobalt in the alloy. These weren't local impurities. They were the fingerprints of ore from the Rhineland or even Scandinavia, proving that elite smiths had access to materials spanning continents. But the hoard is just one piece of the puzzle. In Norway, archaeologists examining Viking swords found microscopic layers of charcoal and bone ash trapped between steel folds, proof that smiths used organic materials to control carbon diffusion long before chemistry explained why it worked. A shattered Lombard helmet from Italy, when reassembled, showed hammer marks matching descriptions in an 8th century manuscript previously dismissed as poetic exaggeration. Even rust holds clues. Oxidation patterns on chainmail from the Crusades reveal whether links were welded shut or riveted, exposing regional variations in craftsmanship once thought uniform. The most humbling realization: many of these techniques can't be replicated today, even with our technology. When master smiths attempted to recreate a Saxon Sikh's blade using the hoard's metallurgical data, their first 20 attempts failed. The metal either cracked or dulled too quickly. It wasn't until they mimicked the exact temperature fluctuations of a charcoal forge, measured from surviving hearths, that the steel behaved as the ancients intended. This wasn't just skill, it was intuition honed through generations, a dialogue between hand and material that modern automation can't replicate. What emerges from these fragments isn't just a history of objects, but of minds. The curve of a broken shield boss tells us about the smith who understood physics well enough to distribute impact. The alloy mix in a bent spearhead hints at trial and error experiments across decades. Even the mistakes, a sword tang with cold shuts from improper forging, a buckle with uneven solder, humanize these artisans, reminding us that mastery wasn't born perfect. Every shard pulled from the earth rewrites our assumptions, proving that the medieval forge wasn't just a workplace, but a laboratory where innovation burned as hot as the coals. The glow of the forge hasn't faded into history. It's blazing brighter than ever in the hands of modern artisans who have turned preservation into passion. Across the world, blacksmiths are stepping back into the smoke and sparks, not out of necessity, but out of reverence for the craft that once shaped civilizations. You'll find them in unexpected places. A Brooklyn warehouse where a former software engineer hammers out Damascus steel knives using 9th century techniques. A thatched workshop in the English countryside where a woman crafts chainmail with the same precision as her 14th century ancestors. This isn't just hobbyism, it's a movement breathing life into techniques that were nearly lost to industrialization. Historical reenactment groups have become unexpected guardians of these skills. At events like the Battle of Hastings reenactment, smiths don't just demonstrate, they live the craft, smelting ore in clay furnaces, hand-forging nails for period-accurate tents, even recreating the exact alloy mix used in Norman arrowheads. The Society for Creative Anachronism counts hundreds of master smiths among its members, their work scrutinized down to the type of charcoal used, because getting it wrong means breaking the spell of authenticity. Their obsession with detail has yielded surprises. When one group replicated a Viking-era forge, they discovered that alternating layers of birch and oak charcoal produced temperatures high enough to create steel rivaling modern grades, a technique forgotten for a millennium. Television has turned this niche passion into a global spectacle. Shows like Forged in Fire didn't just entertain, they educated millions on the physics of folding steel and the alchemy of heat treatment. Viewers watched as contestants turned railroad spikes into katana-quality blades, proving that ancient methods could hold their own against power tools. The real magic happened off-camera. After each season, applications to blacksmithing schools spiked, proving that watching raw metal transform under a hammer still stirs something primal in us. Universities are now partnering with these modern smiths to unlock history's secrets. At Warwick University, a team reconstructed a 15th century armor-making workshop, using period tools to test how long it really took to craft a full suit of plate. The results overturned assumptions. What scholars thought required months was achievable in weeks, suggesting medieval armories could outfit armies faster than historians believed. Meanwhile, in Japan, the last living masters of Tamahagane steel production train apprentices under government protection, ensuring the art that birthed the samurai's katana won't vanish. The most poignant revival is happening in war-torn regions, where blacksmithing is reclaiming its role as a lifeline. In Ukraine, traditional forge workshops have shifted from making decorative pieces to crafting stoves and tools for displaced communities, their skills suddenly vital again. Syrian refugees in Jordan are learning ancient metalworking techniques as both therapy and trade, weaving their cultural heritage into practical survival. It's a powerful reminder that the forge was never just about weapons. It was and remains about resilience. What fuels this revival isn't nostalgia, but the raw satisfaction of creation in an age of digital abstraction. There's something elemental about gripping tongs and feeling metal yield under precise blows, about producing an object that carries the maker's intent in every curve. The blacksmith's anvil rings across centuries, connecting those who still hear its call to the countless hands that shaped history, one hammer strike at a time. Language itself is a forge where blacksmiths left their indelible mark, not just in steel, but in the very phrases we use centuries later. Consider the command, "Strike while the iron is hot," a battle cry for seizing opportunity. This wasn't just poetic advice, it was literal blacksmithing wisdom. In the workshop, hesitation meant disaster. Heat iron too long and it crumbles. Strike too soon and it resists. Timing was everything, whether shaping a plowshare or a sword. Medieval commanders adopted the mantra for warfare, realizing that momentum, like molten metal, cools rapidly. The phrase endures because it captures a universal truth. Action and precision must collide at the perfect moment, or the chance is lost forever. Then there's too many irons in the fire, a warning born from the chaos of a smithy stretched thin. Picture an apprentice frantically juggling glowing metal rods, each demanding attention before they cool into uselessness. Armies learned this lesson the hard way. The Spanish Armada's disastrous invasion of England in 1588 wasn't just a naval failure, it was a case of literal too many irons. Overloaded ships, scattered troops, and tangled supply lines mirrored a forge overwhelmed by unfinished work. The idiom survives because it speaks to a human flaw, ambition outstripping capacity, whether in war, business, or daily life. Even praise carries the anvil's echo. To call someone stalwart, meaning unshakably strong, harks back to the Old English stalworth, literally worthy of steel. Knights weren't just brave, they were metal-worthy, their valor measured against the unyielding resilience of a well-tempered blade. Conversely, feckless, ineffective originates from the Scots fec, meaning the essential part, like the core of a sword where strength mattered most. To lack fec was to be as useless as a blade with no spine. The battlefield birthed its own forge-born phrases. Going at it hammer and tongs evoked the smith's most basic tools, repurposed to describe brutal, all-out combat. When English longbowmen rained arrows at Agincourt, French chroniclers wrote that the sky rang like a smithy, a metaphor so visceral you can almost hear the clang of metal on metal. Even defeat had its metallurgic twist. To meet one's Waterloo echoes Napoleon's downfall, but lesser known is the phrase, broken like a poorly quenched sword, used in medieval chronicles to describe armies shattered by poor leadership. The most enduring legacy, though, lies in the word fabricate. Today it implies deception, but its Latin root faber means craftsman. To fabricate was to create with skill, like a smith turning ore into art. That linguistic shift from honest labor to suspicious invention mirrors how industrialization distanced us from the forge's tangible truth. Yet these phrases remain, scattered through our speech like iron filings drawn to a magnet, proof that the blacksmith's craft didn't just shape weapons. It shaped the way we think, fight, and even speak, one fiery idiom at a time. Blacksmiths stride through our stories not as background figures, but as keepers of primal truths, an archetype so enduring it feels etched into our collective imagination. Think of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, where the dwarves of Moria aren't just miners. They're metallurgists chanting over molten rivers of gold, their hammers striking rhythms older than the mountains. Tolkien didn't invent this reverence, he tapped into something ancient. The smith as both creator and destroyer, capable of crafting objects of beauty or instruments of devastation, resonates across cultures because it mirrors humanity's own duality. Video games amplify this mystique. In The Witcher 3, the grizzled armorer Fergus Grimm isn't just a vendor, he's a storyteller, his workshop littered with broken blades that whisper of battles lost. Players don't just buy swords, they absorb lore through the scratches on a crossguard or the choice between Damascus steel and silver for monster hunting. Skyrim takes it further, making blacksmithing a skill tree where players temper weapons at grindstones, learning through gameplay what medieval smiths knew instinctively, that every fold of steel carries consequences. These digital forges succeed because they capture the tactile satisfaction of creation, distilling centuries of craft into visceral button presses. Yet no modern portrayal burns as brightly as Game of Thrones' Tobho Mott, the Cohoric smith who reworked Valyrian steel, a rare feat in a world where most swords are mundane. His shop, glowing with unnatural blue flames, isn't just a workplace, it's a temple to arcane knowledge. When Gendry apprentices under him, we're not watching a boy learn to hammer metal, we're witnessing the passing of guarded secrets that could tilt wars. This echoes history's reality. The best smiths were always more than laborers. They were keepers of power, their forges were magic and metallurgy blurred. Why does this archetype persist? Because the blacksmith represents transformation in its purest form. From a song of ice and fire to demon slayer, stories return to the moment when raw ore becomes purpose, a metaphor for growth itself. There's alchemy in watching a character like Fullmetal Alchemist's Winry Rockbell craft automail limbs. She doesn't just repair bodies, she rebuilds identities. Even children's tales like Beauty and the Beast give us Lumiere, the enchanted candelabra who winks at his past as a metalsmith, reminding us that crafting light from darkness is the oldest magic of all. The darker side of this fascination reveals our anxieties. Hellboy Roman II Goblin Black Market, where creatures trade cursed weapons, taps into the fear that unchecked creation leads to chaos. Norse myths warned of this with the cursed sword Tyrfing, which brought doom to whoever wielded it, a cautionary tale about technology outpacing morality. Modern dystopias like Mad Max continue this thread, where the ability to forge weapons becomes the difference between survival and annihilation. The smith's anvil, then, isn't just a tool, it's a mirror reflecting how we view progress itself. What's most telling is how these portrayals transcend accuracy. Real medieval smiths rarely had the cinematic bravado of Kingdom Come, Deliverance's fiery workshops. But when Assassin's Creed Valhalla lets players upgrade Ravensthorpe's forge to unlock better gear, it's capturing a deeper truth. Civilizations rise and fall on the strength of their metalworkers. The archetype endures because it satisfies a hunger for tangible mastery in an increasingly abstract world. Proof that even in pixels or prose, the ring of hammer on anvil still calls to something primal in us all. Every hammer strike that shaped a sword carried an unseen weight, the knowledge that this weapon might defend a village or slaughter one. Medieval blacksmiths inhabited a moral gray zone, their forges supplying both the shields of crusaders and the axes of marauders. Guild records from Nuremberg tell of masters who refused commissions from nobles known for brutality, while others secretly marked their blades with hidden sigils, as if to say, this edge was not meant for tyranny. Yet survival often overrode scruples. When the Duke of Burgundy demanded 500 broadswords, few smiths could afford to ask how they'd be used. The tension between craft and conscience wasn't abstract. It echoed in the life of Elias of Cremona, an armorer who fled his workshop after learning the helmets he'd crafted were used to massacre civilians during the Lombard Wars. His diary, preserved in a Milanese monastery, confesses the torment. Can the beauty of a rivet's placement absolve the horror it enables? Contrast this with the anonymous smiths of the Teutonic Order, who saw their work as holy, etching crosses into sword hilts destined for Baltic crusades. Their conviction mirrors modern defense contractors who view weapons as tools of peacekeeping, yet the same steel that guards borders also fuels endless conflicts. Modern arms manufacturing amplifies these dilemmas with industrial scale. A 15th century smith might produce 10 swords a year, each bearing his fingerprint literally and ethically. Today's factories output thousands of rifles monthly, their origins obscured by supply chains spanning continents. The medieval guild system at least enforced accountability. Masters faced their customers across the anvil, reading the intent in a knight's eyes as he tested a blade's balance. Now, algorithms match weapons to buyers with clinical detachment, severing the last threads of artisan responsibility. Some medieval solutions still resonate. The Venetian colleganza system allowed smiths to collectively veto contracts they deemed unjust, a precursor to modern arms embargoes, but with hammers instead of paperwork. Islamic armoring traditions often incorporated Quranic verses condemning aggression, transforming weapons into moral reminders. Even the Vikings had their sigablot, where smiths blessed weapons before battle, but only if the cause was deemed worthy by the gods. These weren't perfect safeguards, but they acknowledged that crafting instruments of death shouldn't be divorced from conscience. The most haunting parallel lies in specialization. Just as medieval smiths perfected arrowheads designed solely to pierce plate armor, today's engineers develop munitions for urban warfare or autonomous drones. Both represent the chilling pinnacle of craftsmanship devoid of context, the ability to solve technical problems without confronting the human cost. A surviving sketch from a 15th century German workshop shows a modified mace head annotated for striking through mail, its inventor proud of the innovation, oblivious to the shattered ribs it would cause. 5 centuries later, the same disconnect lets engineers optimize cluster munitions without walking the fields where their submunitions lie dormant, yet glimmers of redemption persist. Contemporary smiths, from 3D printed gun activists to ballistic techs, increasingly face the same reckoning their medieval counterparts dodged: the difference. Digital trails now ensure creators can't claim ignorance when their designs enable atrocities. Perhaps the true legacy of those ancient forges isn't the weapons they produced, but the unresolved question they force us to confront: where does the maker's responsibility end and the wielder's begin? The anvil's echo carries further than any sword stroke, demanding answers we're still struggling to hammer out. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil echoes through a quiet valley in Austria, where UNESCO-listed fire welding techniques passed down since Charlemagne's time are taught not in classrooms, but through calloused hands guiding younger ones. This is the living museum of blacksmithing, where preservation isn't about locking artifacts behind glass, but keeping flames burning in forges from Japan's Banshu Hamano district to Norway's Hjorundfjord. In 2018, UNESCO added German bladesmithing to its intangible cultural heritage list, recognizing what guilds knew for centuries: that the true masterpiece isn't just the sword, but the unbroken chain of knowledge required to create it. Japan offers perhaps the most meticulous preservation model. In Seki City, the Nihon Tanran Dakukai Guild maintains 14th century Tatara steel production, a week-long ritual of smelting iron sand in clay furnaces, where masters judge temperatures by the color of flames rather than gauges. The national government designates certain smiths as living national treasures, their workshops becoming classrooms where apprentices learn to read steel's song, the subtle hiss of proper quenching, the dull thud of an imperfect weld. Similar programs thrive in Toledo, Spain, where the Escuela de Herreros teaches Moorish-era damasoning alongside modern metallurgy, proving tradition and innovation needn't be adversaries. Grassroots efforts often outshine institutional ones. In Denmark's Ribe Viking Center, reenactors don't just demonstrate, they live as 9th century smiths, extracting bog iron using peat-fired furnaces identical to those found in archaeological digs. Their discoveries rewrite history. By replicating a Frankish arrowhead design, they proved some military advancements were actually logistical. The shape wasn't deadlier, but required less precious steel per unit. Meanwhile, Ghana's Ashanti blacksmiths preserve lost wax casting methods through oral epics, embedding metallurgical secrets within folk tales about the spider god Anansi. Technology unexpectedly aids these ancient arts. The British Artist Blacksmiths Association has laser-scanned medieval tools to create exact replicas, while 3D modeling reveals why certain hammer shapes survived centuries. Their weight distribution minimizes wrist fatigue during marathon forging sessions. In India's Hyderabad, the centuries-old Patan Patola silk weaving families have partnered with local smiths to digitally document tool-making techniques, creating a genetic code of craftsmanship that could outlast any single artisan. The real hope lies in how these traditions adapt. Brooklyn's Harbour Forge teaches at-risk youth 17th century joinery to create modern sculpture, while Nairobi's Ujenzi Collective trains female smiths using recycled materials. From the fire-welded gates of Marrakesh to the singing swords of Kyoto, what survives isn't frozen in time. It's alive, breathing, and still shaping our world, one glowing ember at a time. Blacksmiths didn't just shape metal, they forged a philosophy in fire, one that resonates far beyond the medieval workshop. Consider the discipline required to fold steel 100 times, each layer pressed with exacting precision, knowing a single lapse could mean a blade that shatters in battle. This wasn't mere repetition. It was the art of delayed gratification centuries before the term existed. Modern psychology touts the 10,000 hours rule for mastery, but smiths lived it instinctively, their calloused hands proof that excellence isn't born from inspiration alone, but from the daily choice to return to the anvil, even when the fire burns low. Patience, too, was woven into every hammer stroke. Unlike today's instant solutions, a medieval smith couldn't rush the process. Iron demanded respect. Ore had to be roasted for days before yielding usable metal, and quenching a blade too quickly would doom it to brittleness. This wisdom translates eerily well to our era of burnout and half-finished projects. The smith's lesson, true resilience isn't about speed, but understanding the natural tempo of transformation. A 14th century guildmaster might nod at modern research on deep work, recognizing his own practice of shutting out distractions to listen to the subtle changes in the metal's color and sound. Adaptability crowned their craft. When the Crusades introduced Damascus steel, European smiths didn't cling to tradition. They reverse-engineered the foreign blades, blending techniques to create something new. Faced with charcoal shortages, they redesigned furnaces. When gunpowder threatened their trade, the best pivoted to firearms. Their survival hinged on viewing change not as a threat, but as fresh ore to be smelted. In an age where industries rise and fall overnight, this mindset feels startlingly relevant. The blacksmith's workshop was the original, agile environment, where problem-solving meant improvising with whatever the moment provided, whether salvaging scrap metal or inventing new tools mid-project. The most enduring legacy, though, lies in their balance of strength and subtlety. A master smith knew when to strike with full force and when to use glancing blows, shaping metal without breaking it. That duality, power tempered by precision, mirrors the leadership principles now taught in executive seminars. Whether navigating a corporate merger or a family conflict, the ability to gauge when to push and when to yield remains invaluable. The smith's hammer, in this light, becomes a metaphor for influence, its effectiveness determined not by weight alone, but by the hand that guides it. What ultimately emerges from the soot and sparks is a blueprint for thriving in uncertainty. The medieval world was no less chaotic than ours. Plagues, wars, and shifting powers upended lives without warning. Yet blacksmiths endured not because they controlled their circumstances, but because they mastered the art of reshaping them. Their anvils were stations of reinvention, where raw materials, whether iron or adversity, could be heated, hammered, and honed into something purposeful. That's the quiet revelation waiting in the forge's glow. The past's most practical craftsmen were also its profoundest philosophers, teaching us that resilience isn't found in avoiding the fire, but in learning to work with its heat. As the embers of history cool, we see the blacksmith's true impact stretch far beyond the battlefield. Their hammers didn't just shape steel, they molded the very skeleton of civilization. Picture the sprawling cities of today, their skyscrapers and bridges, and you're seeing the legacy of those smoky medieval workshops. The same principles that made a knight's armor articulate and light calculated weight distribution, strategic reinforcement echo in the steel frames of modern architecture. Every rivet in a suspension bridge, every girder in a train track, carries the DNA of techniques perfected over anvils centuries ago. The blacksmith's influence lingers in unexpected places. Take the precision of a Swiss watch. Those tiny, interlocking gears owe their existence to the same meticulous craftsmanship that once fitted 1,000 chainmail rings into a seamless shirt. Even our language bears their mark. Phrases like "strike while the iron is hot" or "hammer out a deal" remind us how deeply their world shaped ours. these weren't just artisans. They were the original engineers, their forges serving as the first research and development labs where trial and error birthed breakthroughs that would outlast empires. Yet their greatest lesson wasn't in metal, but in mindset. In an age of mass production, the blacksmith's ethos, where every creation bore the maker's hand, where flaws weren't hidden but studied and solved, feels almost revolutionary. Modern makerspaces and artisanal movements champion these same values, proving that the allure of transforming raw material into purpose never fades. The satisfaction of holding something you've forged with your own hands, whether it's a blade or a bracelet, taps into something primal and profoundly human. So the next time you watch a film and hear the ring of clashing swords, or pass a wrought iron gate scrolling with intricate designs, pause and listen closely. That sound, that beauty, carries the echo of countless unnamed smiths whose ingenuity built the world we inherit. Their stories may not fill history books, but their fingerprints are everywhere, in the tools we use, the buildings we inhabit, even the words we speak. And if this journey through fire and iron has sparked your curiosity, we'd love to hear which revelation surprised you most. Drop a comment below, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to keep unearthing history's hidden architects. Until our next adventure, keep the fires of curiosity burning, because the past, like molten metal, is always ready to be reshaped by those willing to wield the hammer.